December 1943. America's most feared general, the man who struck terror into Nazi hearts across North Africa and Sicily, was suddenly and mysteriously removed from leading the greatest invasion in military history, while a desk general with no combat commands took his place. George S. Patton should have led D-Day. Everyone knew it. The Germans feared it, and his own troops demanded it. So why did Eisenhower and the Allied command sideline the one man Hitler himself called that crazy cowboy general? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the winter of 1942, the world was burning. German tanks rolled across Europe like a steel flood. Japanese soldiers planted their flags on islands across the Pacific. American boys who had never left their hometowns were dying in deserts and jungles thousands of miles from home. In Washington and London, old men in suits sat around tables covered with maps, moving pins and markers like chess pieces, deciding which young men would live and which would die. The weight of the war pressed down on everyone, but especially on the leaders who had to make impossible choices every single day. The United States had entered the war just 1 year earlier, after Pearl Harbor turned the morning sky black with smoke and sent American ships to the bottom of the harbor. Now America was building factories faster than anyone thought possible. Women who had never worked outside their homes were welding steel and riveting airplane wings. Teenagers lied about their age to join up. The country was transforming itself into a war machine, but it took time. Time that boys were dying to buy. Time that Stalin and Russia was demanding the Allies use to open a second front, to take pressure off his soldiers who were bleeding and freezing on the Eastern Front. Time that Churchill and Roosevelt knew they needed to build up enough strength to punch back at Hitler where it would hurt most. In North Africa, the Americans had finally tasted victory. After early defeats that made newspapers back home wonder if American soldiers could really fight, a general named George S. Patton had shown them how. He was impossible to miss. Tall and straight-backed, he wore riding boots polished to a mirror shine, and ivory-handled pistols on his belt like a gunslinger from the Old West. His voice was high and rough, and when he cursed, which was constantly, even hardened sergeants blushed. He slapped soldiers on the back and told them they were the finest killers God ever made. He cried when he visited field hospitals and saw the wounded. He quoted the Bible and ancient Roman generals in the same breath. His tanks moved faster and hit harder than anyone expected. When Patton's Third Army came at you, you ran or you died. The newspapers loved him. The soldiers loved him. Back home, mothers and fathers saw his picture and felt safer knowing their sons were under his command. He was everything America wanted in a general. He looked like a warrior from the history books, like he had been born to lead men into battle. When he led the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, his troops raced across the island so fast that the British commander, Montgomery, looked slow and careful by comparison. Patton was proving what many people already believed. He was the man who would win this war. In Sicily, the heat was brutal. It pressed down on soldiers like a heavy blanket soaked in water. Dust got in everything. In food, in canteens, in the corners of men's eyes. The fighting was fierce and close, village by village, hill by hill. Young men who had been selling shoes or planting corn 2 years ago were now killing other young men with rifles and grenades. Some handled it, others broke. Their hands shook so badly they could not hold a weapon. They stared at nothing and saw everything. They jumped at sounds that were not there. The doctors had a name for it: combat fatigue, battle exhaustion, shell shock. Whatever you called it, it meant a soldier's mind had been pushed past what it could take. Patton did not believe in it. To him, there were only two kinds of soldiers: those who fought and those who were cowards. On a hot August day in 1943, he walked through a field hospital tent in Sicily. The smell hit him first. Blood and sweat and antiseptic, and something worse, the smell of bodies breaking down. Wounded men lay on cots. Some were missing arms or legs. Some had holes in their bodies held together with gauze and prayers. Patton moved among them, shaking hands, calling them heroes, his eyes wet with tears of pride. Then he came to a soldier sitting on a cot, whole and unwounded, head in his hands, shaking. Patton asked what was wrong with him. The soldier said his nerves were shot. He could not take it anymore. Something in Patton snapped. His face went red. He screamed that there was nothing wrong with the man, that he was a coward and a disgrace. Then Patton hit him. An open-handed slap across the face. The crack echoed in the tent. Nurses gasped. Doctors froze. Patton called the soldier yellow and told him to get back to the front lines. A week later, he did it again. Another hospital. Another soldier with no visible wounds, but a mind that had shattered under the weight of war. Patton slapped him too. Even pulled out one of his ivory-handled pistols and threatened to shoot the man right there for cowardice. Doctors and nurses witnessed it again. This time, they could not stay quiet. Word spread through the medical corps like fire through dry grass. Some officers tried to keep it quiet. General Eisenhower, Patton's superior and friend, heard about it and was horrified. He wrote Patton a letter telling him to apologize. He ordered the story buried. War correspondents who knew about it agreed to keep silent. For a few months, it worked. But secrets like that do not stay buried during war. By November 1943, the story broke. Newspapers back home ran headlines about America's top general striking sick soldiers. Radio commentators debated whether Patton should be court-martialed or sent home in disgrace. Mothers of soldiers wrote angry letters. Some defended Patton, saying war needed hard men who did not coddle weakness. Others called him a bully and a brute. The controversy swallowed everything else Patton had accomplished. His victories in North Africa and Sicily seemed smaller next to the image of him slapping shell-shocked boys who had already given everything they had. In Washington and London, the leaders planning the biggest operation of the war suddenly had a problem. They were preparing Operation Overlord, the invasion of France across the English Channel, the strike that would put Allied armies on the beaches of Normandy and begin the push to Berlin. It would require more than 1 million men, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, and perfect timing. One mistake could send thousands of boys to drown in the cold water or die on the beaches under German machine gun fire. The operation needed a supreme commander, someone to coordinate British, American, and Canadian forces, someone who could manage not just battles but alliances, someone who could work with Churchill and Roosevelt and keep Montgomery and other prickly generals from fighting each other instead of the enemy.
Everyone had assumed it would be Patton. He was the most famous American general. He had the best combat record. The Germans feared him more than anyone else. Intelligence reports showed that Hitler's commanders believed wherever Patton went, the real invasion would follow. But now, with the slapping scandal fresh in everyone's mind, the leaders had doubts. Could they trust Patton with the biggest operation in history? What if he said something stupid to the press? What if he insulted the British or Canadians? What if his need for glory made him take risks that got thousands of boys killed? War was not just about killing the enemy anymore. It was about politics and public opinion and keeping allies working together. In December 1943, the announcement came. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord, not Patton. Eisenhower, a man who had never commanded troops in combat, who had spent most of his career behind desks, who was known more for his easy smile and political skills than for tactical brilliance. The news hit like a bomb. Patton was stunned. His fellow generals were confused. The American public wondered what was happening. How could the man who had defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps and conquered Sicily be passed over for the most important command of the war? Patton was ordered to England but given no clear role. He sat in headquarters while other men planned the invasion. He watched from the sidelines while generals with less experience than him decided how D-Day would unfold. Something was wrong. Something had happened that went beyond 2 slaps and 2 hospital tents. The whispers in the halls of command suggested that Patton had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, too much of a liability. But if that was true, why keep him around at all? Why not send him home? What were Eisenhower and the other commanders planning? And what would happen to America's most fearsome general while the greatest battle of the war was being prepared without him? The slapping incidents were not just 2 moments of anger in the heat of war. They were windows into how George S. Patton saw the world, and how that world was changing faster than he could accept. In those August days in Sicily, when his hand struck those soldiers, he believed he was doing what generals had always done. He was hardening his men, weeding out weakness, showing them that the only way home was through the enemy. In his mind, fear was something to be beaten out of soldiers, not treated like a sickness. He had grown up reading about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, men who drove their armies with whips and glory and the promise of victory or death. That was how wars were won, Patton believed. That was how men became soldiers. But the world had moved on without him. The Great War, which had ended just 25 years earlier, had shown military doctors something new and terrible. Soldiers could break without being wounded. Their minds could shatter under the constant thunder of artillery and the sight of friends torn apart by shells. Thousands of men had come home from that war unable to sleep, unable to stop shaking, unable to return to normal life. At first, commanders called them cowards too. But as the numbers grew, doctors realized this was not cowardice. It was injury, just not the kind you could see with your eyes. By the time World War II started, the military had psychiatrists, field hospitals had mental health sections, and combat fatigue was recognized as a real condition that could happen to any soldier pushed too far. Patton rejected all of it. To him, it was modern softness infecting the warrior spirit. He believed that if you let men think they could break, they would break. If you told them their minds could be wounded, they would wound their own minds to escape battle. He saw the new psychology as dangerous, a crack in the foundation that would bring the whole army down. So when he saw those soldiers sitting unwounded in hospital tents, he saw cowards hiding behind fancy medical words. He saw disgrace. And he reacted the only way he knew how, with violence and shame. When the story finally broke in November, General Eisenhower tried to contain the damage. He ordered Patton to apologize personally to the soldiers, to the medical staff who witnessed it, and to every division under his command. Patton did it, but barely. He stood in front of thousands of soldiers and said words of apology that sounded hollow coming from his mouth. Everyone could see he did not mean it. He thought he was right and the world was wrong. That stubbornness, that absolute certainty in his own judgment, was part of what made him a great combat commander, but it was also what made him impossible to trust with the biggest operation of the war. The contrast between Patton and Eisenhower could not have been sharper. Where Patton was fire and fury, Eisenhower was calm and steady. Where Patton saw war as personal combat between warriors, Eisenhower saw it as a massive machine that required perfect coordination of 1,000,000 moving parts. Where Patton gave speeches that made men want to charge into machine gun fire, Eisenhower gave speeches that made British and American generals agree to work together despite hating each other. Patton won battles. Eisenhower won alliances. And D-Day needed alliances more than it needed one brilliant fighter. The planning for Operation Overlord was unlike anything ever attempted. It required ships to carry more than 150,000 soldiers across the English Channel on the first day alone. It required aircraft to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines in the dark. It required naval guns to pound the beaches, and engineers to clear obstacles under fire, and medics to save the wounded, and supply officers to make sure ammunition and food kept flowing once the troops were ashore. It required keeping the whole plan secret from German spies, while coordinating with British commanders who thought they knew better than the Americans, and American commanders who resented taking orders from the British. It required managing Winston Churchill, who loved dramatic operations but worried constantly about casualties, and Franklin Roosevelt, who had to think about American voters back home who were tired of war. It required someone who could smile and shake hands and make everyone feel heard, even while making the hard decisions that would send thousands of young men to their deaths. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Patton could do none of that. He was brilliant at moving tanks and reading battlefields and inspiring soldiers to push beyond exhaustion. But he could not sit through long meetings without insulting someone. He could not hide his contempt for generals he thought were too cautious. He called the British cowards and the Russians barbarians, sometimes in public. He told reporters things that made politicians in Washington panic. He treated war like a personal competition where glory mattered more than politics. And D-Day was all politics. It was a political operation wrapped in a military operation, and putting Patton in charge would have been like putting a lit match in a room full of gasoline. So Eisenhower got the job, and Patton got silence. For months, he sat in England with no clear assignment. He was kept away from reporters, he was not invited to planning meetings. The greatest invasion in history was taking shape, and America's most famous general was nowhere near it. Soldiers who had served under him asked where he was. German intelligence officers noticed his absence and started to wonder. If Patton was not involved in the planning, maybe the invasion everyone expected was not the real invasion after all. Maybe it was a trick. That gave Eisenhower and his planners an idea. If the Germans feared Patton so much, if they believed no major operation would happen without him, then his absence could be used as a weapon. They created a ghost army, a fake unit called the 1st United States Army Group, and put Patton in command of it. They stationed it in southeast England, across from Calais, where the English Channel was narrowest. They built fake tanks out of rubber and wood. They sent fake radio messages that German spies could intercept. They let rumors spread that Patton was preparing for the real invasion at Calais, and that anything happening at Normandy would just be a diversion. The Germans believed it. Hitler believed it. Even after D-Day began at Normandy on June 6th, German commanders kept divisions at Calais for weeks, waiting for Patton's fake army to launch the real invasion. So Patton became a ghost. The warrior who wanted glory more than anything else became a decoy, a trick, a piece of misdirection in the largest con game ever played. He commanded imaginary soldiers while real soldiers stormed the beaches without him. His reputation, built on real blood and real victories, was now a tool used by other men to win a battle he was not allowed to fight. The irony was almost too perfect. The man too dangerous to lead D-Day became essential to its success by not being there at all. The spring of 1944 was the longest spring of George Patton's life. Every morning he woke up in England knowing that across the Channel, German soldiers were building concrete bunkers and planting mines on beaches where American boys would soon be dying. Every day he watched other generals plan the invasion while he commanded an army that did not exist. He inspected fake tanks made of inflated rubber that would fool German spy planes. He sent radio messages about troop movements that were complete lies. He gave speeches to imaginary divisions. His entire purpose had become to make the enemy believe he was somewhere he was not, doing something he was not doing, leading men who were not real. In his diary, which he wrote in every night, Patton let his fury pour out onto the pages. He wrote that small men who had never faced real combat were making decisions that would get soldiers killed. He wrote that Eisenhower had become a politician instead of a general, more worried about keeping the British happy than about winning battles. He wrote that he was being persecuted by inferiors who were jealous of his success and afraid of his honesty. He never wrote that maybe, just maybe, they had good reasons for not trusting him with supreme command. That thought could not fit inside his mind. He had spent his whole life preparing to be a warrior, studying every great battle in history, training his body and his mind for war.
How could anyone think he was not the right man to lead the greatest battle ever fought? But late at night, when the anger cooled, another feeling crept in: shame. Not for slapping those soldiers, he still believed they deserved it, but for being used as a trick, a puppet, a ghost. His whole identity was built on leading men into battle, on being the tip of the spear, on facing the enemy with courage and steel. Now he was a scarecrow dressed up to frighten crows. The Germans were afraid of him, yes, but they were afraid of a lie. They thought he was planning an invasion at Calais, while the real invasion would happen at Normandy without him. His fearsome reputation, earned through blood and victory, was now just bait in a trap set by other men. On June 6, 1944, the trap sprang shut. Before dawn, thousands of paratroopers dropped through the dark sky over Normandy. At sunrise, the largest armada ever assembled appeared off the coast. Battleships and destroyers and transport ships stretching to the horizon. Naval guns opened up with thunder that could be heard 50 miles away. Bombers filled the sky. And then the landing craft doors dropped and young men ran into machine gun fire on beaches with names like Omaha and Utah and Juneau. They died in the surf. They died on the sand. They died climbing cliffs and crossing fields filled with mines. But they kept coming, wave after wave, and by nightfall they had a foothold in France. Patton listened to the radio reports from his fake headquarters in England. His face was stone. He did not curse or throw things or rage against the unfairness. He just sat there, listening to other men fight the battle he should have led. His staff officers stayed away from him that day, afraid of what he might say or do. But he did nothing. He just listened and waited, a warrior forced to sit on the sidelines while the war went on without him. The Germans, meanwhile, still believed the lie. Even as their soldiers fought and died on the Normandy beaches, Hitler and his commanders kept entire divisions at Calais waiting for Patton's invasion. They could not believe that the Allies would launch the real invasion without their best general. For weeks after D-Day, German reinforcements that could have pushed the Allies back into the sea stayed at Calais watching for Patton's ghost army. By the time they realized they had been fooled, it was too late. The Allies had their foothold and were pushing inland. The deception had worked perfectly. Operation Fortitude, as it was called, may have saved thousands of Allied lives by keeping German divisions away from Normandy during the critical first days. And it had worked because of Patton's reputation. Because the Germans respected and feared him so much that they could not imagine the invasion happening without him. In a strange way, he helped win D-Day by not being there. His absence was his contribution. The warrior had become the weapon, but not in the way he ever wanted. Slowly, Patton began to understand something that he did not want to understand. War had changed. It was no longer just about brave men charging at each other with weapons. It was about deception and logistics and public relations and keeping alliances together. It was about managing politicians and reporters and foreign generals with fragile egos. It was about planning supply chains and understanding that tanks need fuel, and ammunition needs trucks, and soldiers need hot food and mail from home. It was about psychiatry and morale and understanding that modern weapons could break men's minds as easily as their bodies. The kind of war Patton loved, the kind he had studied and trained for, where glory and courage decided everything, was dying. Maybe it was already dead.
But Patton could not change who he was. He was 60 years old. His ideas about war and men and courage had been formed over decades. They were not just thoughts in his head. They were the foundation of his identity. To admit that the modern army did not need the kind of general he was would be to admit that his whole life had been preparation for a role that no longer existed. So he did not admit it. In his diary, he wrote that history would prove him right,
That future generations would see that soft politicians and careful planners had almost lost the war by sidelining their best fighter. He wrote that Eisenhower would be forgotten, while his name would live forever. He needed to believe that. Without that belief, what was he? In late July, 2 months after D-Day, Patton finally got his chance. He was given command of the Third Army and unleashed into France. The breakout from Normandy had bogged down in the hedgerows, and the Allies needed someone who could move fast and hit hard. They needed Patton the fighter, not Patton the supreme commander. And he showed them what he could do. His tanks raced across France faster than anyone thought possible. He saved surrounded paratroopers. He closed traps around German divisions. He proved that as a battlefield commander, he was still the best America had. But he proved something else too. He proved that Eisenhower had been right. Patton succeeded because he was part of a larger plan, a piece in a machine built and coordinated by someone else. He was perfect for his role, but he could never have built the machine himself. The Third Army's charge across France in the summer and fall of 1944 was everything Patton had dreamed of. His tanks moved so fast that supply trucks could not keep up. His soldiers captured towns before German defenders knew they were coming. He rescued the 101st Airborne Division when they were surrounded at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, turning his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and attacking through a blizzard. Newspaper reporters started writing about him again, calling him America's greatest fighter. Soldiers who served under him wrote letters home saying they would follow old blood and guts anywhere. For a few glorious months, Patton was doing what he was born to do, leading men in battle and winning. But even in victory, he could not stop being himself. In September, he gave a speech comparing the Nazi Party to American political parties, saying that regular Germans who had been Nazis were no different than regular Americans who were Democrats or Republicans. The comment caused an uproar back home. People asked how he could compare a political party that had murdered millions of Jews to normal American politics. Patton did not understand what the problem was. He saw the Nazi Party as just another government organization, and he thought practical Germans who had joined it to keep their jobs should not be punished after the war. He believed America would need those Germans to help rebuild the country and to stand against the Soviet Union, which he was already convinced would be the next enemy. That was another problem. Patton wanted to keep fighting. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, he was not relieved like most soldiers. He was disappointed. He told anyone who would listen that America should not stop at Berlin. The Red Army was pouring into Eastern Europe, and Patton believed Stalin was just as dangerous as Hitler had been. He wanted to rearm German soldiers and use them to push the Soviets back to Russia. He said it in meetings with other generals. He said it to reporters. He seemed unable to understand that after 6 years of war, after millions dead, after concentration camps and bombed cities and families torn apart, the American people wanted peace, not another war. The politicians in Washington were horrified. Eisenhower told him to be quiet. Patton kept talking. In October 1945, Eisenhower relieved him of command of the Third Army and gave him a meaningless paper job overseeing military history. It was a public humiliation, a clear signal that Patton's career was over. At 60 years old, the general who had terrified the German army was being put out to pasture like an old horse that could not be trusted not to kick. Some newspapers defended him, saying he was being punished for being too honest, for saying what other generals were thinking but were afraid to say. Others said he was reckless and dangerous, a man from another century who did not understand the modern world. Both were right. Patton knew his time was ending. In letters to his wife, he wrote that he felt like a relic, like a sword hanging on a wall when everyone else had moved on to guns. He wrote that the world no longer wanted warriors, that it wanted managers and politicians and men who said the right things at the right times. He was bitter, but underneath the bitterness was something else. A kind of lost feeling, like a man who had trained his whole life for one role and then discovered the role no longer existed. On December 9, 1945, Patton was riding in a car on a road in Germany when another vehicle pulled out in front of them. The crash was not severe. No one else was badly hurt, but Patton was thrown forward and broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days, he lay in a hospital bed, unable to move, struggling to breathe. The warrior who had spent his life in motion was trapped in his own body. On December 21st, a blood clot reached his heart and killed him. He was buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers of the Third Army who had died under his command. The irony of Patton's story is almost too perfect to be real, but history does not care about irony. The general who should have led D-Day could not lead D-Day because of who he was. His strengths and his weaknesses were the same things. The aggression that made him a brilliant attacker made him impossible to control. The confidence that inspired his soldiers made him unable to listen to anyone else. The old-fashioned warrior code that drove him to greatness also made him slap shell-shocked soldiers and insult allies and say things that turned the public against him. He was the right man for some jobs and the wrong man for others, but he could never accept that there were any jobs he was wrong for. D-Day succeeded without Patton leading it, but it succeeded partly because of him. His reputation kept German divisions away from Normandy. His Third Army breakthrough after the landing turned the invasion into a rout. He was essential to winning the war in Europe, just not in the way he wanted to be essential. The lesson of Patton's story is not that he was a bad general. He was a great general, maybe the best combat commander America ever produced. The lesson is that even great generals have limits, and modern war had grown beyond the limits of any one man, no matter how talented or fearless or brilliant. Eisenhower, the man who took the job Patton wanted, went on to become President of the United States. He understood something Patton never could, that leadership in the modern world required more than courage and tactical genius. It required patience and diplomacy and the ability to work with people you did not like or respect. It required understanding that war was not separate from politics, that every military decision had political consequences, and that managing those consequences was just as important as winning battles. Patton died believing he had been mistreated by smaller men who did not understand war. Maybe he was right. Or maybe the world had simply moved past the kind of war he understood, the kind where individual warriors could change history through force of will and brilliance in battle. Maybe D-Day succeeded not despite leaving Patton on the sidelines, but because the men who planned it understood that the biggest operation in history needed a builder, not a fighter. It needed someone who could unite armies, not just lead them. It needed Eisenhower. The question that remains is not whether Patton was a great general. He clearly was. The question is whether being a great general was enough. And the answer that D-Day gave was simple and brutal. It was not. Not anymore. The age of warrior generals like Patton was ending, and the age of diplomat generals like Eisenhower was beginning. Patton was sidelined from leading D-Day because he belonged to a past that was dying, and D-Day belonged to a future he could not see. That was the real tragedy. Not that he was denied his moment of glory, but that his moment had already passed before he realized it was gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.